All right. Well, welcome. We'll go ahead and start, and we'll just welcome folks in as they join us during this time. Okay. All right. So my name is Andy McNeil, and I am with the Compassionate Friends. And it's certainly my honor to present this session today. Before we get started, I had just a few announcements. I wanted to remind everyone about our uh, conference coming up in Baltimore over the weekend of 4th of July. We will be there together. We have right now a little over 600 folks registered. We're expecting several hundred more to register over the next month or so, and have just a great gathering of our TCF members. We have some great keynotes scheduled and excellent breakout sessions and a lot planned. It's the 250th anniversary of our great country, and we have some things planned to recognize that over the weekend together. And if you're able to be there, we would love to have you. If you're not able, we understand it being a holiday weekend, and certainly we'll miss you being there. But those who can join us, we'd love to have you be part of that. And then I just wanted to mention that on our website, if you're curious about other webinars that we've offered or archives, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be in our archives along with a number of other webinars that we have done over the last several months. You can find that under the Find Support tab on the TCF website. If you go to that tab and you scan down to webinars, you'll be able to access a list of upcoming webinars and also our archived webinars. So thank you. And then also, if you have topics, email us. You can email me at andy@compassionatefriends.org or sarah@compassionatefriends.org. And Sarah is SARA. And just give us your thoughts on topics that you might like to hear in a webinar. We're setting those up at least two a month through the end of the year and on into next year as well. So with that, let's go ahead and start our topic for today. This webinar is titled Managing Guilt, Grievances, and Sorrow After Profound Loss. And as I said, I'm Andy McNeil with the Compassionate Friends. This is a topic that can be one of those difficult topics, not only to present, but a difficult topic to be part of and to sit in, because we're talking about some of the more challenging emotions and reactions that we have in our grief. It's actually a topic that sometimes people just avoid talking about because uh, there's also varying ideas around these topics, and it sort of goes a little bit deeper into the experience of grief. So we're going to do our best today over the next hour just to talk about each of these items: guilt, grievances, and sorrow, and very much focus on that idea of managing. And the title was uh, selected purposely. I was very intentional about using the word managing because there are constructs in our society that I've said this before that I think are inaccurate, and they don't adequately reflect the experience of grieving people. And one of those really is around the idea that somehow there are things we can do to get rid of our grief or to eliminate grief or to move on from grief. And the reality is that grief is a part of our lives. It's something that we experience, something we adapt into our lives, and grief is enduring. And so using the word managing was purposeful. In a lot of ways, we learn how to manage our grief, to carry our grief, to adapt our grief. And it's no different for these experiences of guilt and grievances and sorrow. Now, it doesn't mean that some people may resolve guilt or grief or sorrow in their life. I'm not saying that it's not possible. I'm simply saying that to assign any sort of this is what it looks like to do that is not helpful to the majority of folks who are living with profound loss. And so I was very purposeful in using the word managing, and we're going to talk about some of those things. We'll have a lot of coping strategies we're going to talk about over the next hour or so. So let me share my screen. I'm going to have a PowerPoint that I'll use as our guide for our discussion today. And we'll just go ahead and get things moving. Okay. So as I said, our topic is managing guilt, grievances, and sorrow after loss. Now, again, just to reemphasize before we get too far into the topic, as I said, there are certain societal constructs of grief that are misleading. The idea of predictable stages or set timelines or normative intensity, moving on, getting over, or restoring back to. We tend to live in a very restorative society where we want to get back to the way things were, and which becomes very challenging. And for many people in grief, those types of ideas perpetuate the stigma that exists around grief. And these items are really part of that stigma, that grief that lasts too long or is too intense is somehow not normal, or it's abnormal. And the reality is that it's the opposite of that. Grief is intense and it is enduring. It's all of those things. Uh, because these things are misleading. It does perpetuate stigma, but it also perpetuates misinformation, unaddressed grief. Many people hide their pain from others because they don't want other people to judge them because maybe they're not doing it right. And so we tend to stop reaching out, stop sharing, stop all of those things. It's one of the reasons why having a community like the Compassionate Friends is so important, because it gives us a community that gets us, right? A community that understands and that can validate the experience as it really is, not what maybe some of these societal constructs say it should be. The reality is that grief is an experience we live. It's not a problem we solve, or it's not something we get rid of or we get over. Grief is enduring, it's messy, it's extremely disruptive, it's beyond painful, it's unbearable, life altering. We can put your words in there, whatever those are. Feel free. You can put them in the chat if you want. Is a lot more than what our society says it is. And in some ways, it even lacks a language that doesn't fully capture what that experience is. In other words, if you haven't experienced a particular loss, you don't know what it's like to experience that particular loss. You can guess, you can wonder, you can all of that, but you don't know until you walk that road yourself. Um, Coping with grief is hard work. That's another important thing I want to put in here, because I'm going to be talking about a lot of coping ideas today, and it's easy for me to rattle it out of my mouth. It's much harder for us to do because grief is can be debilitating. It's exhausting. It zaps us of our energy. It brings us to the sometimes it's the bottom of our ability to even move to the next moment. And so I just want to make it clear that what I'm sharing today um, are ideas and thoughts that we can incorporate. But at different places in our grief, we might find ourselves at places where all we can do at that moment is just take the next breath, is just put our feet on the floor. And maybe that isn't even something we're able to do at that moment. Um, so patience with ourselves as we experience our grief becomes important in that regard. So coping is hard work, and it sometimes even feels, the point is, it sometimes feels unattainable or even impossible. And some of the things I might share today, you might be at a place where you say, I just don't think that's attainable right now. And I don't want you to place it as a burden on yourself. I want you to be patient with yourself and recognize that all of the things I'm talking about today can be very hard fought challenges, but it's worth the challenge uh, to work in that direction. And we'll talk about that more as we move along. But that grief is an adaptive, transformative process where we land in a new place. It is not all of these other things that we described there in that first bullet point. More so, it's all of the things that impacts us. It affects our lives. It changes us, and we find ourselves in a new place. And learning to live in a new place, particularly when we might have preferred the place we were in, is words are inadequate, but um, it's even more difficult and challenging to live in that new place where we land. So I just wanted to say those up front before we got into the topic today. So I'm just going to lay this out with a few thoughts and suggestions, and I have several sections on just how to cope and what it looks like. And my belief is that we start in our management of these very difficult uh, experiences in grief, of guilt and of grievances and of deep sorrow by first naming it. I think the first, and really it's a coping strategy to actually name it, to give your experiences a language, because it often lacks a language and it's hard to really describe. You ever try to describe to someone what your grief is like who hasn't experienced it? It's hard to even figure out the right words to use, truly help people understand what that's like for you. So the first place to start, I believe, is just giving it a language. Let's name what we're talking about. So today we're looking at very three specific experiences, and I just wanted to give credit to Reverend John Claypool. I didn't come up with these three things on my own. These are constructs that Reverend Claypool laid out in a book called Mending the Heart. Uh, John Claypool was a member for a period of time of the board of directors for the Amelia Center, where I served as the executive director for many years. I met him many years. He was an older man when I met him. And I met him many years after the death of his daughter. She died from leukemia when she was 9 years old, and he was a Baptist minister at the time. And when I met him, he was much older and he was an Episcopal minister. And to me, his story was one of the first where I really, it resonated with me that grief is a transformative experience. And it doesn't mean that there was anything wrong with him being a Southern Baptist minister. It just means that grief does impact us and it changes us. And I think it's significant for me to mention that when his daughter died, he was a Southern Baptist minister. When I met him, he was an Episcopal minister. And how our life can be shaped and impacted and changed by so many experiences, and very particularly by profound loss, and how that shapes and changes our lives. So in that book, he lays out grievances, grief, and guilt. And I took that same concept. He calls them three wounds that we carry in our lives. That and he calls them wounds because he really talks about that they are things that are enduring and that stay with us. That we have wounds from these experiences. With that, we can associate grievances with anger, grief with sorrow, and guilt with self-blame. This concept. So I just wanted to lay out these are the three things we're going to talk about today, and let's break them down. Let's give a little bit more language to them. Now, I would suggest that you do your own work on this too. Part of the challenge that we have with any of these three experiences is that quite often there's something happening that is happening to us that we are experiencing. We're not choosing to be angry. We're not choosing to feel guilty. And we're not choosing to feel intense sorrow. We just are experiencing it. And sometimes when we're not able to break it down and give it words, it gives it even more power in our lives because again, it's not something we have a choice about. But when we can name it, somehow naming it, at least we know what it is and we can define it in some way. And that's that first step on managing it if we can give it a name. And so do your own work. I'm going to lay out a little bit around it right now, but you can just sit down in a quiet moment, or maybe if you like it louder, or music playing or anything, a distraction going on, whatever it might be. Sit down and just write words, whatever it is, whatever your experience is, if it's grievances, if it's that anger, if it's if it's guilt, if it's that self-blame, if it's intense sorrow, and I'm going to put some words up in a moment around intense sorrow. Just just write words that you associate with that for you and begin there. Begin with giving it a definition of your own. But here's some thoughts around grievances. And Reverend Claypool really kind of outlines it in his book this way that grievances are when others have hurt us, or insensitive behaviors of others, or destructive actions from others, or feelings of abandonment, or feeling insulted by other people. In other words, someone has done something and I have a grievance against you. You have done something to hurt me, and I am angry. And anger tends to be the primary emotion, though there can be other emotions associated with it. Anger tends to be that primary emotion that we carry. And going even further, we can also have anger over more than just grievances, but a lot of times we might find that that anger is connected somehow by some way we've been offended by other people or or circumstances or things that have happened in our lives. So it could be anger about injustice, an injustice that was done. It wasn't right. We shouldn't have had to go through that. We shouldn't have had to endure that. That wasn't right. And this sense of injustice, or anger about the behaviors of others, or intense grief that manifests as anger. Sometimes intense grief, and we're going to talk about intense grief and sorrow in a moment, sometimes that manifests as anger. Anger, it can be a power emotion. In other words, it's one of those emotions that we get this our adrenaline gets going, and it gives us this push. And so sometimes rather than experiencing the sorrow or other parts of our grief, it will manifest itself as an outward anger about the situation. Or sometimes it is anger and it's just tied up in all of these other things. And again, I'll put some of those words up in a moment. Or it could be anger towards yourself. And we'll talk about that in a moment. That certainly guilt can produce a sense of anger even about ourselves. Anger towards your person who died could be, or abstract anger, anger at the universe and why is the world the way that it is, or anger at your at God, if if you believe in God, or even if you don't believe in God, anger about the whole idea of God and all of those things. Just very abstract, maybe don't know where to put it, but it's that anger is still there and it still exists. Or it can also, this idea of grievance can be associated with like that sense of injustice. Why did this happen to my person? Why my family? Why me? Why not other people? I've said this on numerous occasions. One of the things that causes me to ask this question often of why is if I see someone who's lived a really long life and they're just not a good person. Like throughout their life, they just have not been a good person. They've made decisions that have wreaked havoc on other people's lives, and they get to keep living. And that's something I've struggled with, I think, my entire life. When I see that and I go, but my person, that person wasn't doing that in the world, and why us? And that type of thing. So this sense of justice that can be part of anger. So again, for yourself, you can write down those things that what is your anger? Thinking about what is the source of that? What are the sources of the grievances that you carry toward other people or situations? What is that? And define it for yourself. Um, Name it, right? The next is the idea of grief or sorrow. So I like to use the word sorrow. Grief is associated with so many things in our society now, not just profound loss. And I mean, we even have phrases like "good grief." Grief is not easy, and it is discombobulating. It's all the things we described earlier. And so I kind of like this word sorrow because sorrow really that sense of heaviness, and it weighs us down, and we carry it in our lives. And Dr. Claypool would say it's when we have been wounded by life. So if grievances are we have been wounded by others, uh, grief or sorrow is we've been wounded by life. Sorrow over it could also be though sorrow over the life our person lived. Depending on our situation, we can have sorrow about the past, about the present, and about the future. It could be sorrow over the death, or just sorrow over the life um, lost, the future lost with that person. It can take on a lot of different, and again, you can put your own bullet points there. You can take on a lot of different descriptions in that regard. But here's some of the intense grief and just sorrow emotions. There's more than this. We could have filled up 4 or 5 slides, but I just wanted to put up some words because we often stop at sad, mad, scared. We don't go much beyond those things. And really, there's so much more there. And I would just encourage you, again, you can take a picture of this slide. I won't stay on it too long, but bullet point your own experiences. What is it? Give a language to your sorrow. What is it for you? But just thinking maybe on a deeper level of what that experience is for you. And then just again, a reminder that grief is an experience that we live like a storm. A storm, if you think about a storm, when you go through a storm, there's lots of experiences we can have when we do it. Some people experience fear, some people experience awe because of it's so large and the beauty of it and all of those things. Some people, as I said, to have fear. Some people have anxiety. There are physical symptoms. I get migraine headaches if a storm comes in too quickly. It will activate a migraine headache in me. You ever smell a storm? You know it's coming, or the temperature drops 10 degrees and the wind blows and you can feel it across your face. Very physical reaction to a storm, or you just this sense that you have to batten down the hatches. So it you have to do certain things to prepare, um, whatever that might consist of. All of these things that are part of a storm. So if you think about a storm is something we experience mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, socially. Grief, that's grief. Grief is mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, social. There's really not a part of our life that's not impacted by our grief in a lot of ways. And so, really thinking of it on a deeper level when you consider, so you start again naming it, giving a description to this is what my grief is like. I did a training this past weekend was with some of our folks in the Northeast, some of our chapters from the Northeast United States, and we were in Leominster, gathered together, and wonderful time seeing everyone. But it's one of the things that I had a conversation with someone when I was there about comparing grief. You're not making a list so that you compare your grief to others. You're simply making a list so that you can better understand your own grief, how it has manifested in your life, because it's your story and you get to have the story that you have. Everyone gets to have their own truth. No one can tell you, no, that's not what grief is, because you say, no, that is what my grief is. And no one can tell you that it's not that because you're the one who's living it and experiencing it in that moment. Now, the last of the three that we're looking at is this naming the idea of guilt. Okay. And sometimes we use the word guilt and regret interchangeably, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But we can have guilt and regret over many things. We can have thoughts and feelings and behaviors. It could be guilt over our thoughts, feelings, or behaviors prior to the death, maybe not even associated with the death. It could be some sort of guilt we carry in our lives. I've had people who actually relate the death of their person to some past behavior they did and have said to me, I believe that my person died because of this thing I did way back when I was a teenager, when I was a young adult. I did this and now I'm paying the piper. And I've had people say it to me that way. So it could be guilt over something prior to the death, not even associated necessarily with the death, but we associate it with the death in some way. Or it could be guilt or regret over something associated with the death, or it could be guilt or regret following the death, something choices that I might have made or reactions that I had to my loss that I wish I could take back. And I've heard all of the above described, and I've experienced in my own life any of these three at different times and junctures. But I did want to talk about the difference between guilt and regret. I wanted to think of it as two different things. So rather than using them interchangeably, I just want so again, this is part of the nuances. Part of naming it is getting into the nuances and saying, well, you know what? I don't think it's regret that I have. I think it is guilt. I am blaming myself, which is different than regret. Regret. So there is some research, and I'm going to give the next slide will help you give you some information on the research around it. But let's just kind of define it out. The research around it defined it separately. Looked at guilt as self-blame, personal responsibility that I could have done something different and there would have been a different outcome, or it's a violation of a personal moral or ethical code. And so I feel like I've broken one of my own moral ethical codes, and I have guilt about it. Regret, on the other hand, is defined as that I believe there could have been possible better outcomes, but would not have ultimately changed the fact that my person died. Painful thoughts and feelings that are associated with that, and unfinished business. So you might say, I wish I would have said I love you one last time. I wish I would have said I love you more often. I wish I would have spent more time with that person. I wish we had more time together. I regret that we don't, right? That's more the regret as opposed to guilt being that I did something that is directly related to what happened, and I feel guilty about that. Or again, I violated a personal moral code or ethical code. So the research was done by Strobe, and you can see the article there, and feel free to look it up and read more about the study. What they found in the study is that the people who are in the study, who they had them select which one is your experience, guilt or regret, and then they took them through a series of surveys, and what they found in the results is that guilt was correlated. Those who said I had guilt was correlated with heightened grief reactions both early and over time in a person's grief. So it was very enduring in the grief experience. And then regret demonstrated no correlation to heightened grief reactions, neither early in bereavement nor over time. So a person had regret, but they didn't associate it with their sense of distress in their grief, because distress certainly is a part of grief, but they didn't associate their regret with that. It was simply regret. They wish it would have, should have, could have, wish they could have done things differently. So I just wanted to note that because I presented it one time just as an aside, lecturing on this topic, and someone came up to me and said, "Thank you. That definition helped me to realize that it's actually not guilt that I have, it's regret." And that was helpful to them. So I just wanted to put that out there and distinguish between the two when we think about the nuances. And by the way, another aside, these are some ways that we try to avoid guilt, but it's not just guilt we try to avoid. We actually try to avoid lots of these experiences in grief. I found that the more painful the experience, the more we attempt to avoid it. And that's just logical. Anyone would, no one wants to feel pain. Well, most people, let me say it that way, most people don't want to experience pain, and so we avoid pain. And there's a lot of ways we do that to try to stay busy. And again, you can probably list out 100 ways that you do that. I've got 100 ways that I do it. But very specifically with guilt, will be such a thing as denial, blaming others, projecting, punishing ourselves is one way that we avoid guilt. We just go ahead and punish ourselves rather than leaning into the actual situation of guilt. Allowing guilt to reign free. Some people are just like, to heck with it, I'm just going to do whatever. Or distraction. And of course, distraction, we use that in these other areas to avoid anger, to avoid, these other emotions, deep-seated, very challenging emotions. Now, we don't have time for it today, but I also want to just encourage you, if it's other very difficult emotions, because there are other difficult emotions other than guilt and grievances and sorrow. If there are others, again, name it for yourself. And some of the things that I'm going to talk about from this point forward will also apply to those. But we're really paying more close attention to these three during this session. But my first point is in managing these three experiences of grievances, guilt, and grief, sorrow, is that name it, give it a language. It doesn't have to be the language I just described, but give it a language so that you can have some idea of what you call it. So it's not just happening to you, but you know what it is and you're defining it in some way. Now, the second thing I would put out there, and again, these are certainly things I've used in my own life, but I just want to say to you, people say, well, where do you come up with this? I have had, and I call it a sacred honor, to sit with thousands of people who've experienced profound loss in my lifetime. Hundreds, I don't know, I've lost count, but so many people. And some of this also not just comes from my own life experience, but from just being with people and having people tell me, this is what I did, this is how I coped, this is what worked, this is what didn't work, all of those things. And over the years, just pulling it together. So that first thing, naming it, is important. But another thing that's important, because we tend to avoid these things, is that it's important to experience it, not just name it, but actually experiencing. And you say, well, I am experiencing it. You just said we don't choose it. It happens to us and we experience it. And it is true. But we also can try to run from it and avoid it and all of those things. And there is a very intentional way that we can lean into it. And that's what I mean by experiencing it, is that we choose to lean in to that loss orientation, that experience of grief. Now, there is a model for understanding grief. It's called the dual process model of grief, and it's by Strobe and Schutt, the research. And again, you can look up, just type that into Google, you can look up and learn a lot more about this model. What I like about it is that it really lays out and says that in our grief, what they recommend in grief is that we oscillate between loss orientation and life orientation. That if we're that there's a balance to it, and that if we're leaning into our loss orientation and not at all into life orientation, that's not the place that we necessarily want to be. Or if we're just leaning into life orientation and not leaning in and experiencing our grief, that's not the balance either. It's really oscillating between the two. Now, for life orientation, they use the word restoration orientation. Now, those of you who have heard other lectures that I've done, I stay away from the word restoration only because to me it has connotations of going back to something. I'm restoring it back. as opposed to I'm landing in a new place. And for me, that's just a very important distinction. And so, but I did want to put that there and say that that's, how they refer to it. But really what they're talking about is life and living and loss, and these two things that are going on at the same time in our life. Again, sometimes avoidance of that is done by doing these things on the right hand side, where people will stay busy, do all of these other things, and then realize that grief is not going anywhere. You can't outrun it. You can't outlast it. It's there, and grief kind of rears its ugly head, whether or not we lean into it or not. The suggestion with this model is that if we lean into it, then we're better able to oscillate, to do that back and forth. Now, I just want to say something about early grief. If you're listening to this and you're going, gosh, I can't even think about life orientation right now. Again, I want to go back to something I said at the beginning. All at different places in our grief. And what I don't want is for anyone to look at any of these slides and judge themselves too harshly based on them. Again, it's easy to say these things. It's harder to do these things. And so part of what we can do, and maybe the first suggestion should have been being patient with ourselves before even naming it, just being, cutting ourselves some slack, whether anyone else does or not, and recognizing that grief is hard. And we don't have to make excuses for grieving. Grief is something we're experiencing. Okay. Um, at the same time, in our grief, to be intentional about experiencing what that grief is, missing our person, feeling the feelings, whatever they are. Again, hard feelings, even hard feelings like guilt and anger. And sometimes anger is even deeper than that. It's rage, not just anger, right? Giving my grief experiences a name, as we said, expressing grief, remembering my person, wrestling with the irreversibility of my loss. This is a big one that I've seen so often in myself and other people, where it's just, I didn't want this. I don't want it. I don't want to be part of this club. I don't want to have experienced this. And it's a true wrestling with that I don't want it. And that how hard it is, that it's irreversible. I can't change it. I can't do anything about it. I have to live with it. And again, can create an intensity there. And then life orientation are more activities like meaningful life experiences, relationships with others, new and old, coping behaviors, creativity, doing for others, everyday life experiences, routines, rituals, hobbies, those types of things, things that have to do with life. Now, again, some people will say, well, I just can't even think about those things. I've had so many people over the years, and myself, where, and I think Strobe and Schutt would say this as well, is that I there's a part of grief where we feel disconnected from those things. So even when we do them, they just don't have the same luster that they had before. And so that the desire to do them is not even there. But the suggestion is that whether the desire is there or not, that we somehow create some routines and rituals and things that we do that are life oriented, even if we don't feel fully present at that moment. I had a mom who described it to me this way. She was about 2 years, well, probably closer to 3 years after the death of her daughter. And she had been coming to counseling for some time. And she came in one day and something was different about her demeanor. And I asked her, I said, your demeanor is a little different today. I'm curious what's going on. And she said, well, I've been volunteering at my church every summer since my daughter died. And it just is lackluster. It's really, I've just been faking it, just going there, but not really fully present. She said, something was different this year. This is the third summer, and something was different. And it's hard to describe what it was, but for the first time in 3 years, I actually felt present and connected. And then when I asked her, I said, well, if you could put your finger on it, what would it be? She couldn't. We spent the next hour with her describing all that she had been through over those 3 years, all of the choices that she made, hard ones in the midst of her pain, just to keep connecting, keep trying to be part of life, even though she didn't feel like she wanted to be. And really, ultimately, she at the end said, maybe Andy, maybe it was just all of that, just all of that. And at some point, I kept being stubborn and I just kind of faked it until I made it, and began describing it in that way. So the point is experience it, experience your grief, and attempt to put yourself in places where you also experience life in some way, and oscillate between the two as part of your life. You know, pain, reason why you would want to lean into it is because pain longs to be validated. If we just hide it and keep it in here, we don't validate it with other people. But when I can say it, and then someone else says to me too, thank you for saying that. You gave me words for my pain. Thank you for sharing, right? Then we can be validated, or it longs to be understood or witnessed, just to have someone else know what I'm going through so that I'm not alone, or I know that I'm not alone, or to be acknowledged, just acknowledged that this is going on in my life, or to be in community, or to be expressed, or to be addressed. That when we lean into it, we're able to better do those pieces and experience those pieces. Another thing that we can do is to just bring in some coping strategies, right? So we're experiencing our pain, but we're also experiencing life experiences. So the idea of coping strategies are usually around mind, body, spirit. Like, what am I doing for my mind? What am I doing for my body? What am I doing for my spirit? Um, some of the things, these are just things I put down. There could be lots of things that you do that you use for coping. And again, even if they don't work fully, attempting to continue to do some of those things, even though they may lack luster at the moment. Predictability, routine, and rituals, getting those into our lives, having some sort of routine, even if it just feels um, disconnected, but you still have a routine and you're doing that it can be helpful. It helps us to realign and readjust. Searching for meaning and purpose. This is from Viktor Frankl. If you haven't ever read the book, Man's Search for Meaning, it's an important book that was written back in the 1950s about Viktor Frankl's experience in the death camps in World War II, where his entire family died. So he's associated with profound loss. And it was his experience in the death camps. And he really leaned into three things that helped him, he believed, survive the camps ultimately, and then ultimately to be able to continue surviving after finding out about the death of his entire family in the camps. He was the sole survivor. Three things: relationships with people, animals, and nature was helpful to him. That he was in relationship in some way. That he kept looking outward. Creativity or work. That he was doing something. He said even when the Nazis would give me a job, he said I chose to do it the best I could because it brought meaning in my life to step back and go, look, I did that. Look how nice that looks. Look what I accomplished. He had to focus in to do it, right? But he did it nonetheless, and it helped. And then the third was his attitude, the attitude that he chose in the midst of what he called unbearable suffering. That he even said, I decided that if the Nazis took me out to kill me, that they weren't going to get to decide the attitude I had when they did it. I was going to decide that. So he called it the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose our attitude no matter what our circumstances might be. And then a few other things, just hobbies, exercise, volunteering, new unrelated experiences, all sorts of things you can do with coping strategies that connect you with life and living. It doesn't mean, again, that you feel the sense of connectedness, but you're going through the motions, you're doing the hard work of doing those things, even though, and sometimes even in spite of the way we're feeling or what we're experiencing or what we're going through at the moment. Another thing that people have shared with me is that telling someone helps. I think it's why support groups are helpful, where we can just be somewhere and say it. We can just say it to someone. Just tell someone, I need to tell someone. Or maybe a trusted person that you sit down with and say, look, I am carrying this guilt. And it's not just regret, it is guilt. And I feel guilty for, and saying it to someone, but choosing someone who won't judge you, or maybe ahead of time saying, I'm going to share something with you, and I don't need you to fix it. I don't need you to lecture me. I don't need you to try to talk me out of it. I need you to hear me tell you what I am feeling inside or anger. I'm not looking for you to give me an answer to the anger. I just need you to hear me say, this is what I'm angry about. It's not fair, and I need to say it, and I need to put it out there right now into the world. So telling someone can be powerful, or maybe your depth of sorrow, that you find someone you can trust to hold that space for you. And again, it might be that you have to educate the person ahead of time to say, look, I want you to be this person. I don't know if you can be, but here's what I need. And saying it to them and then putting that out there. It's actually one of the ways individual counseling can help. And I know shopping for a counselor can be challenging at times. Keep looking. Keep looking till you find that right person who doesn't just give you silly advice or um, or doesn't minimize your grief or your experience, but someone who holds that space. Just being able to tell someone about my guilt, my anger, my sorrow, and to lay that out there for people. Another thing is express it. And some people have said, well, how is that different than experiencing it, than leaning into it? And in a way, experiencing it is this is one way we can experience it by expressing it. But this also has an outward sense to it. It's taking what's in here and it's putting it out here. And there are a lot of ways we can express it. Now, I know this is a kid, but I love this picture because to me, this kid is doing something that many of us wish we could do, or maybe we already have done, is just scream, just just scream, just let it go deep down inside and just let that out and just yell at the top of our lungs. Um, but expressing, that's one way we can do it. Another way we can express it is through writing, putting it down on paper. And I already talked about giving it a language, but it could be even beyond that. It can be putting it into a story or writing our story or creating a narrative around it or whatever that might look like. But we can do it that way. We can also express it through physical activity, exercise, things that we do. I can remember at times in my life when I've experienced loss. I used to be a runner, and just running. I find a really big hill that I typically would not be able to run all the way up. I'd have to stop, and I would just run all the way up, and I would press it, and I was putting all of my pain into every step that I took, right, and whatever that might look like. So expressing, there's lots of ways you can express it other than verbally, but finding ways that I take what's in here and I put it out here. Now I still take it with me, but part of when we're experiencing it, it's hard to really name it. But when we can express it, we sometimes can give it a name even better when we can do that. So expressing it, channeling it is another thing that we can do with our anger, with our sense of guilt, with our sense of sorrow, channeling it in some way, right? Like supporting causes associated in some way, being an advocate somehow, so that you say, I don't ever want anyone else to have to experience this. So I'm going to go and do something about it. There are people who have done things to change laws that have prevented other people from having to experience that. I've known families whose children were accidentally run over, and now they went and were part of changing the laws so that now cars are required to have backup cameras, so that we can uh, help people coming behind us, right? And there's 100 other examples that I could give around illness or treatments or insurance companies or medical care or any of those things. There's a lot of ways that we can be advocates and use and channel our anger or even our sense of guilt that we say, I'm carrying this, but I want to do something different from now moving forward. If you think about anger and guilt, they're things that are quite often associated with the past. It could be ongoing, but it's quite often associated with things in the past and saying, I'm going to do something different right now. I can't change the past. Right now, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to advocate and I'm going to change some things in the way I live, the way I do, the choices I make, so that I might be able to impact some things. Supporting others, using that energy to support others who are going through something similar to validate their experience so that they feel less alone. Um, and then it could be starting something new. I think about the MAD organization. The founder experienced the death of their person um, from a drunk driver, and they started an organization. I mean, MAD is in the name of the organization, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and then TAPS. I think about TAPS, the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, which was founded by Bonnie Carroll, who took her own pain and her loss after her husband's death and could not find support for military families. It just didn't exist, very specific to military families. And so she created something and channeled that to be this organization that's 30 years old that serves thousands upon thousands of families and has helped so many people over the years who are experiencing a military death. Another thing that we can do both with guilt and with anger and grievance is to lean into forgiveness. Now, forgiveness is one of these words. It's a hot topic, and again, it has lots of connotations for different people. Probably what I think about when I say it may be different than what you think about when you say it. But it is this idea, and I'm very particular, intentional about saying leaning into forgiveness. I don't say forgive because it's not that easy. This whole idea of forgiveness, the reality, at least it's been in my life, has been that forgiveness was not something about forgetting. It really was something that I had to just do, really, in some ways, for myself. One of my early losses in life um, was the death of my grandfather. He was murdered by his battle buddy from World War II. All these years later, he was in his 70s when this happened. He served in his early 20s, his teens, really 18, 19 years old. So all these years later, he's murdered by his battle buddy. And I remember that intense heat of rage that you have over an injustice that's been done. And the idea of needing to lean into forgiveness. And really, I personally didn't do it for the sake of the person who killed my grandfather. I ultimately did it in a lot of ways for myself. Um, Here's an interesting definition of forgiveness. Forgiveness is giving up all hope for a better past. Forgiveness is giving up all hope for a better past. Again, it's this thing, I can't do anything about what happened there, but what do I do from here moving forward? And this can be true for guilt, carrying that sense of guilt that I can't do anything about that, but I'm going to do something about now and what this looks like moving forward for me. So what am I doing now moving forward in regard to these things? And for some people, if forgiveness isn't the right word, maybe it's allowing for second chances. And this is for you just as much as for other people. Most people I've met um, are willing to forgive on some level, depending on what it is. But they're willing. If someone comes to you and they are just apologetic and they mean it, and you see that they're shifting the way they're doing in their life, most of us will give people a second chance. But we are really hard on ourselves. Many of us really struggle with giving ourselves second chances. And so I just encourage you to lean into this idea of allowing yourself to have second chances. Here's another way to say it. Let the past become your teacher, not your judge. The past become your teacher, not your judge. You cannot change the past, but you can decide that you're going to do something different starting now and live in that way and walk in that way, right? So let the past become your teacher, not your judge. What is it that I'm going to carry with me from that? Um, Another way, if you can't, if second chances doesn't work for you, let yourself off the hook. whatever that might look like for you. To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you. I had a lady in one of the moms groups that I facilitated many years ago, and her daughter had been murdered by her daughter's husband had murdered her daughter, and she was raising her grandkids. And she said to the group one day, she said, she said, I decided years ago that I had to somehow let myself off the hook by leaning into this idea of forgiveness, not for his sake, but for my sake. She said, he had already killed my daughter. I wasn't going to let him kill me too. And she really believed it would lead to that in her life. So she made a choice to to let some of that go for her own sake, not for the sake of the person who did it. Forgiveness is the key that can unshackle us from a past that will not rest in the grave of things over and done with, is another quote that I like to use. It's been meaningful for me and other people that I've shared it with. And just a few more things with the few minutes that we have left. Embrace change. Embrace change. Make room for change. I know change is hard. Grief is a transformative experience. We are transformed by our loss. And we have a challenge to actually lean into that and be part of that change in our life. And so just embracing it a little bit, just that as hard as change is, to begin to give that a language. Write down what is different now than before my person died. How am I different? What does that look like? And even making room for growth. Not, and don't hear me wrong here. I know that any of us would say, I give all of this back, all the friends I've made since the death of my child, everyone, so I can have my person back. Don't hear me say that this happens so that you can grow. I don't know why bad things happen in the world and in our lives. I don't. And I don't pretend to assign any judgment to that. But I do know that growth happens and can happen in our lives. Um, I don't have a lot of time to go into it, but if you want to Google and research this idea of post-traumatic growth, we're going to work on having a presenter on this topic in the future. And it's the idea, it's research that was done by Dr. Ted Tedeschi, not Ted, um, Dr. Tedeschi and Dr. Calhoun for over 50 years of research on this. And just 5 domains that they found of growth areas people experience after trauma, after profound loss. And it's worthy to think about. And this idea that I can actually grow and I can accept the growth, but also hold space for my loss. A lot of times it's hard because we feel like it's an affront to my person, but I can still hold my person, honor my loss, honor all that that means, still hold all of the things, anger, guilt, the things that I have, and still embrace the fact that growth can happen as well in my life. And then this idea of mindfulness, just to give you someone to look up on this, there's a book called Flow. And if you look this book up, and I can't pronounce his name, I'm sorry, I'm not even going to try. But this book has meant something in my life since really the early 90s. And it's this idea of flow state. How can I be present in the moment that I'm in? Grief robs us of that quite often. And so this practice of mindfulness, learning how to just be present in a moment, to focus on my breathing. Again, sometimes all I may be able to do in that moment is just breathe. So just focusing on my breathing in that moment and being present in that moment. And this, check the book out. He has some great ideas around that and what that looks like, and the research that he did with a number of people. Because part of this mindfulness idea is also refocusing our attention. Now, it's not avoiding our pain. It's simply saying, how can I refocus my attention? Now, look at this picture. Do you see a rabbit or a duck? And actually, the picture could be either. All right. And I don't have a lot of time to stay on it, but the idea is that you have to refocus or reset, refocus on something. And so that's that idea of oscillating between loss and between life. Where am I focusing in that particular moment? And what does that look like for me? And then finally, just a couple more. Live intentionally. We spend a lot of time making goals for ourselves. And years ago, I was taught in my counseling degree that you set goals with clients and then they work toward those goals. What I learned very quickly as I sat with people and held space is that it wasn't as much about the goals and it was more about the intentionality of the moment. What am I going to decide to do with myself in this moment? What does that look like for me today? So, in other words, setting my intentions, setting my inputs. Like, what am I going to do in this moment? Don't think beyond this moment, just this moment. I'm sitting on the couch. I feel heavy. I don't think I can even get up and move. I am going to dig deep, find some way to stand up in this moment because I feel so heavy. I'm going to stand up and I'm going to walk out into my front yard and I'm going to walk down the street and back. And I'm just going to do that. I'm going to focus on my input. What do I have control of in the moment? And I'm going to do that in this moment. And then I do the next thing. And I had a gentleman, a dad, who expressed it this way. That after the death of my son, I just started walking every day. I made myself, and I found a park that had a lake and a bench. And I just was going to sit on that bench. I found a bench and I sit on that bench every day, whether I wanted to or not. And then when that bench got boring in the scenery, I'd move to the next bench and the next bench. And he was just being in that moment and being very intentional. So even if you can't do some big, lofty goal or create a whole new organization or advocate for all people, if you can just in the next moment breathe, if you can in the next moment get up and move, whatever it is, it's what are my inputs and what am I going to focus on in that moment? And just a few small things. Be kind to others, even though I may not feel like it. It's going to be kind to the next person and see what that looks like. Be kind to yourself. Again, we're so hard on ourselves. Be kind to ourselves. Let the past be our teacher, not our judge. And then finally, practicing gratitude. This goes back to Viktor Frankl, and I'll close with this. Viktor Frankl said, when I'm no longer able to change my circumstance, I'm challenged to change myself. And what he meant by that was the attitude that I take in the midst of circumstances I really have no control over. And grief is one of those things that so often just has us fully. And again, we're not choosing to grieve. Grief is an experience that we're living in the midst of grief. Victor said, think about the attitude I'm choosing as I'm walking through what he called unbearable suffering. I hope that some of the thoughts that we presented today will be helpful. Again, take the time to write your own language around this. Think about those things, those strategies for yourself. It can be small things, it can be big things. And I wish you a peaceful rest of your day. And I will see you down the road. Thank you.